You center it on not just the fact that sin is is the basis of the relationship, but based on the fact that a lie is enshrined at the center of the relationship. Welcome to the Breakpoint podcast and our Q&A segment, Ask the Colson Center. I'm Shane Morris. I'm here with John Stone Street to answer your questions. All of these were sparked by Breakpoint commentaries and podcasts we've aired, as well as short courses and the Colson Fellows program. If you want to submit a question of your own, you can do that by emailing us at askthecolsoncenter@colsoncenter.org. John, over the last couple of weeks, our colleague Wayne Stender has been choosing some of the questions we get here, and he just has a talent for thematically linking them to not only stuff that we're talking about, at the Colson Center, other things we're doing, but linking them to each other in a way that sort of creates this coherent, narrative over the course of the podcast. At least that's the way it looks to me. So
it's his hidden gift. I had no idea when we hired him he had such a gift of kind of
it really is
stringing
good,
together forced narratives in such a way that make our show interesting. But he did. You're right, though. He does do that, and he connects it all together in remarkable ways.
Well, I love this first question we got, and it links to several others we've had, as well as some of the interviews that I've done in particular lately. There's one that's coming out on Upstream shortly about social media, and I talked with Trevin Wax about the documentary The Social Dilemma. But this listener writes in, several times over the course of several podcasts, the idea has been expressed that we too easily can live in an echo chamber of ideas. Let's be honest, my time is spent reading from a specific curriculum and listening to Breakpoint podcasts, Q&As, weekly recaps, etc., plus watching Colson Center produced webinars, short courses, and What Would You Say videos. I feel more informed and equipped to deal with current events and ideas this year than I ever have in the past, but I'm concerned with all of the carefully curated content that I'm ingesting. I love that. That I'm guilty of living in an echo chamber. You might say a Colson Center echo chamber. Am I negligent if I'm not actively seeking out other voices on current events and ideas, especially those outside of a biblical worldview?
Yeah, let me just be clear. You should avoid all echo chambers except the Colson Center.
The Colson Center echo chamber. You should live there.
That one's okay. Yeah, this is okay to live. It's like, sometimes I talk about how research now says that Americans are more addicted than ever before. Because we're addicted to sex and drugs and chocolate and the internet and smartphones and each other, and that's an old reference for you. And then I get to coffee, and then I'm like, well, wait a minute, that one's okay because that one's mine, right? So I appreciate the thought here. I don't want to give the impression when we talk about the danger of an echo chamber, though, Shane, to give the impression that somehow that means that you should listen to everyone, or that or that every, we have these really strange mantras in our culture that every opinion counts, and that getting a multiplicity of views is always a good thing to do, or just because, in other words, diversity is good for diversity's sake.
Right.
And I'm not talking about diversity of, ethnicity or diversity of gender. I'm talking about diversity of, just opinion. Some opinions are just dumb. Some opinions are dangerous. And of course, many opinions could be wrong.
Do you care to offend audience members and give examples?
Anyone who's listened to us apparently as much as this questioner has is going to know exactly who we're talking about. I just think that that is one of the views, right? When you live in a world in which you've given up on any sort of standard for right and wrong, then the diversity of culture and the diversity of experience becomes the diversity of truth. And that's just not a thing. That actually is something that shouldn't exist. And then things are better as long as there's a multiplicity of voices. They can be better, but they're not necessarily better if you don't have any sort of fixed reference point. So I just think that that's an important corrective to this idea that we don't want to live in an echo chamber, but that doesn't mean that every opinion counts. Some opinions shouldn't count. And of course, it's impossible to live with that standard.
So in other words, diversity of opinion is an instrumental good. It's a means of getting at truth. It's not a good in and of itself. Otherwise, if diversity of opinion is good, then the Tower of Babel was the ideal situation because everyone had a different opinion about what was being said. It's just confusion. It's not it's not in itself something to seek. It's a
Hey, can I just
way
say
of
the
getting there.
Jesus Storybook Bible take on the Tower of Babel is one of the best. Have you seen that?
I totally
It's just-
forget. My wife was reading it to the kids the other night.
Oh,
Not
it's
that
just-
one, but
it's been a long time. It's something like she's talking about how and I'm sometimes I think that Jesus Storybook Bible kind of oversells the story.
Oh, yes.
and this is one of those, but it's actually really funny. But it's something like I forget what it is. It's classic. I should go find it here, and we should.
you must be
read
great
it
at
out loud.
parties, John. That was a great joke.
That was a great one.
was
No,
funny.
it was
No,
something
I
like
love-
somebody says, "Pass me." It's something like somebody said, "Pass me the hammer," and the other person thought you're an idiot, or something
yeah.
like that. It was that's how she framed it. It was
I love
funny.
the one with the meme with Gru from Despicable Me, where he's got his mastermind evil plan, on the board, and he's like, build a giant tower that stretches to the heavens. We will reach God with this tower. All the workers talk in different languages, and it's like, and then it goes to Hebrew or Greek or something, and he looks over and he's all disappointed. Yeah, it's amazing.
That's great. I think that's a great way to put it. That a diversity of opinion is an instrumental good at best. It's not an ultimate good, and that's kind of the confusion that our culture has made it. But I do think, look, you should test everything. That's what the
Right.
Apostle John says. You should test everything. Test all the spirits. Paul says test everything. And I'm grateful that the content that we produce and the training courses and that sort of thing is found to be useful for so many. It's one of the coolest things over the last couple of years to hear from so many people who really appreciate this or really thoughtful about this or maybe disagreed with that, but just the process of disagreeing has actually sharpened all of our thinking on it. And that's what this whole thing is really about. But no, you shouldn't just listen to us. I mean, we produce enough that it will fill your, podcast feed unless you're, maybe driving trucks for a living, and then you can maybe get through all of our stuff. But I think that the most important thing to do is to test everything you hear from us from Scripture and in the community of faith. That's the church is not an optional a membership for the Christian. You are part of the church, and so you need to be part of that local church, and that with the Scripture itself needs to, they need to be brought in as kind of measures of what we're saying, kind of what we're pointing to, and what our guests are pointing to.
This reminds me a little bit of Carl Truman's take in Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, where he says, look, we're in the age of expressive individualism, and we're all expressive individualists, and it's futile to attempt to stop being an expressive individualist. So the best thing you can do is just recognize that's your default setting and move forward on that basis. I think something similar really applies here. We can recognize that, yes, we're in an echo chamber. To some extent, or one extent or another, all of us are in echo chambers. That's just the way the internet curates our existence. That's the way we do it ourselves through what we choose to expose ourselves to, through the conversations we have and the friends we surround ourselves with, the church we go to. We're going to have some kind of skewed perspective on things. It's not going to be an accurate representation of the whole spectrum of opinions. But as we just said, that's not necessarily a bad thing. And being in an echo chamber, quote unquote, doesn't mean you have to be uninformed. There are, echo chambers that will insulate you from the truth, will insulate you from good arguments and criticism against your positions. I like to think that we at the Colson Center don't cultivate one of those types of echo chambers. But there are ways you can counter that and make sure that you're not being deceived by the content you expose yourself to. One of them is, goes back to that old metaphor that preachers love to use of the dollar bills and how people who are tasked with bankers who are tasked with finding counterfeit dollars don't spend all their time looking at counterfeit dollars. They spend their time looking at the real deal, so they know exactly what it looks like and how all the marks and sort of guarantees in that work together, and then they can recognize the counterfeits immediately. I think that's probably something that as Christians we're doing when we study Scripture, when we ground ourselves in the truth of which we've been convinced and which we were, given by the apostles. We're recognizing the real thing such that when we're exposed to something false, we'll be able to say, that's a counterfeit. I would also say watch debates. They're one of the best ways to learn these sorts of all sides of these sorts of issues. Watch what happens when both sides are well represented, and a Christian, for instance, or a conservative, or an advocate for natural marriage or whatever, or a pro-lifer goes up against someone with the opposite opinion, and see how the arguments stand up. And then after a while, when you watch those, you'll realize that debates are kind of the same stock issues re-expressed again and again. There are only so many arguments on an issue. Once you've watched a few of those, you get the shape for how both sides are thinking, and then you're able to really distinguish and choose between them. I'd also say read authors who do what's called steel manning their opponents. Okay, so you've heard of straw man arguments. It's where you basically summarize your opponent's argument really badly, and then knock it down and act like you've won the debate, when in reality you've just lied about what they believe and presented a super weak and pathetic version of it that's easy to defeat. People who steel man their opponents will give the most generous presentation possible of their position. Like, here's the best possible argument that we can make, or that we can find made for instance, the pro-choice position. We're going to go to Judith Jarvis Thompson, or someone who's really thought this through and given arguments that sound really compelling. And then we're going to deal with those. We're not going to deal with, the talking points on Planned Parenthood's website or whatever. That's just an honest way to deal with those ideas. And I think if you find Christian authors, speakers, writers, podcasters who steel man their opponents and then deal with that strongest version of the argument, you're going to be on the right track. And people that come to mind in that vein, obviously C.S. Lewis, I have to mention him, but he does that. He really steel mans.
But he's better than that. C.S. Lewis is one of those guys like Jonathan Edwards who takes his opponent's arguments and actually makes them better.
Yes,
and then takes them down.
Right.
Jonathan Edwards did that to the critics of the Great Awakening, First Great Awakening. I think obviously Lewis does that. I think that there's some examples today of people who really take that seriously to the extreme. I think Scott Klusendorf does that really remarkably on the abortion issue. I mean,
yes.
when he pretends to be an abortionist, he's better at arguing for an abortion than anyone I've ever seen debate.
All the kids in the classroom are just scared spitless.
I had a professor like that in college who was a young Earth creationist and actually argued on behalf of a theistic evolutionist, and it was just a really remarkable thing because he made all of their arguments, way better as well. I think all of those things are so important. And by the way, I'm expecting, and I would be really disappointed if we don't get this question next week, which is, John, I've heard you speak, and you hate that. Bank teller only look at the real thing analogy. Why did you let Shane get away from that? And I'm so tempted to just attack it, although the way you used it is a legitimate use, and people are going to be so confused because I have hammered that illustration for years. But it's a context.
Oh,
it's a contextual.
That's why I used it just to
get at me. No, it's a contextual one. There's a lot to say about that. I would say it's kind of what Nancy Pearcey calls having a baloney detector. There's just, you don't need to know necessarily what's wrong with everything, but you got to have a good sniff test. Those were great suggestions, Shane. I just want to say around the Colson Center a little bit about kind of our philosophy or our approach to content. And if you are that deeply engaged with us, what would you say videos, our podcast, our several podcasts now, the short courses, the webinars, then we try to pull ourselves out of our own echo chamber. There's a strategy that we've really embraced that basically is to offer our platform to really thoughtful people who have thought through these things better than us, and then help other people connect with them. So we feature other authors. Our What Would You Say videos have a whole team of subject matter experts that are experts in the field. And yet we didn't want to make the argument centered around the expert. We wanted to make the argument centered around the argument. And so the experts behind those are not us. Many of us contribute to those, but there are other people that have been willing to help us produce something, for the common good or for the Christian good here. So we try really hard. I'm not saying we always do a great job of it because we produce so much content, but notice that one of the things that all Breakpoint products, all Colson Center products, have in common is and Wilberforce Weekend is a great example of this. I mean, we will have somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 different people communicate, speak, lead, address different issues on that topic of the image of God. So we're going to take the image of God, put it in the middle, and then hit it from about 20 different angles from people who represent a variety of perspectives. Although, granted, we think they're in our camp, right? In other words, there's that mere Christianity that we share, or maybe we can call it now mere orthodoxy that we all share. And we're going to look at it from those angles. But that's one of the ways that we try to get ourselves outside of that echo chamber so that the content that goes out is part of that. I mean, one of those examples is our Proverbs prayer time, right, which we've done every week now for the last several weeks. This week, my friend Cheryl Batchelder, who's really one of the remarkable professional women in America, has former CEO of Popeye's Chicken, did a remarkable turnaround of that organization and so many other things, but just has really thought deeply about what it means to be made in the image of God as a woman, to think about what it means to be called to this world of being a CEO, the success that they've had and that she's had, and what it means to see her work as being her worship. And she led our Proverbs time this week. It was really fantastic. Of course, we've been. You can find all of those. If you've missed those times, you can find those at breakpoint.org/proverbs. That's breakpoint.org/proverbs. And in fact, here's a little highlight of the time that she led of our kind of weekly time of guided prayer through the Proverbs.
When I was a young leader, and I'd get in an awkward situation, maybe at church, I would say things lightheartedly like, yep, all these roles couldn't possibly be intelligent design, and there would be a twitter. And then at work, I would joke that the title of my job was Think Like a Man, Act Like a Lady, and Work Like a Dog. I actually found a book by that title, and I left it out on the desk plainly for people to see. They would laugh momentarily, but they were also processing that confusion about a married mother, a Christian, a wife, a friend, all of those things, and also in a business leadership role. But I would tell you now that I'm in my wisdom years, I think I have more perspective on that calling. And today I would tell you I'm pretty clear that those roles were all God's design for my life, and decidedly part of my calling to serve him faithfully, both in my home and in the corporate workplace.
Well, John, I want to tackle our next question here, and it has very much to do with the clip we just heard and the topic that Cheryl Batchelder was addressing. It's about work as worship, and we did a commentary on this recently based on actually another question we received on the Q&A podcast here. So I'll read this because it brings up really the key question behind the whole thing, which is how do we know when we're working and when we're worshiping? This person says, I resonate with your listener's question for our work is our worship. How does work become worship? Is there a specific thought or prayer that must precede the work for it to transform from the routine drudgery into glorifying our Father? Hopkins' quote mentions, everything gives God glory if being in his grace, you do it as your duty. All things give him glory if you mean they should. This big if reminds me of singing in church back in the 60s and being encouraged to sing like you mean it, almost as if my worship didn't count unless I was serious and sincere enough. Such a difficult thing to evaluate if the quality of my worship is sufficient.
Hey, listen, I'm one of those guys that I can sing with all of my heart, and it doesn't count, man. It has nothing.
At least
to
not
do.
to the people around you listening.
No, it is disruptive. It is sincere but terrible.
Make a joyful noise, as it says.
Yeah,
John makes a noise.
First of all, this is just one of those questions that I love because it just reflects so much intentionality and care and thoughtfulness. And this is one of those things, like, jump on this journey and you're going to be grateful, right? Even if you never figure out exactly what this full answer and you're able to articulate it in 2 minutes or less on an elevator somewhere, this is a remarkable journey, and it'll take you to Dorothy Sayers. It'll take you to Steve Garber. It'll take you to so many different people who have thought so deeply about this. But let me just take that very first question, how does work become worship? Work is worship. It doesn't become worship. Work is worship always. Now, it could be bad worship, but this is a reflection of what we would call a Christian ontology, what really is true and real about the universe. And that is that the God who created everything is always, we are always in his presence. This is what the psalmist says. If you go to the heavens, you're there. If I go down to the depths of Sheol, you're there. Where can I flee from your presence?
Quorum Deo, everything is before God.
Yeah, that's where I was, exactly where I was going next. John Calvin's line, quorum Deo, which is, if you've received I try to sign any books that I sign or thank you notes for people who give through the Colson Center. I often sign quorum Deo, and I hope people are like, what the heck's that? And then they go and look it up, because it just means before God. And it's just something we need to be reminded of, that every moment of our lives is before God. Years ago, I was doing a seminar for a group of seniors at a Christian college and tried to really help them wrestle with this very same question about what is it going to mean now to live in light of the reality of what's true, and that is that this world belongs to God and that you're living in his presence. And there's I went through that whole psalm that I just went, where can we flee from your presence and all that sort of stuff. And one of the students was like, that is frightening, because that means I'm known. I'm known. I think that I can, put this off or hide this or contextualize that. And you're just exposed before God. And that's a remarkable reminder, not only for the things like, some of our moral failures, like we have addressed recently over the last couple of weeks on the podcast and during this segment, but also because of work. I mean, Dorothy Sayers would say the only Christian work is work well done. Now, to really understand that, you need to read the rest of what she talks about in terms of work, but it's a very important thing. In other words, there's something there about stewardship. There's something there about fulfilling our created mandate, which a lot of people want to jump to the Great Commission and forget that God gave humans instruction from the very beginning, and that's still part of what it means to be human. Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it. Let us create man and woman in our image, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air. This authority, this stewardship that God has given humans, which again, not to sneak in another plug, but it's what we're going to talk about all weekend at Wilberforce, which is going to be a lot of fun. But this is such a wonderful question, and I would just say it is. The question isn't if you're worshiping. The question is, how are you worshiping? The question isn't when does work become worship. The question is how do I turn my work into worthy worship, for God? And that has to do and this is kind of implied in the question in so many ways: intention, effort, diligence, surrendering, sacrificing, just giving that to God. Doing that next thing well. And because let me just read this other part of the question, which I thought was great. Is there anything that must precede the work for it to transform from routine drudgery into glorifying our Father? I mean, look, there's a reason that the church developed liturgy and even these senses of hand motions and bowings, and the idea was to make people realize what you were about to do. And of course, it became superstitionalized, if that's a word, in certain contexts, in certain parts of the world, and even in our minds to think, well, it doesn't really count unless I do this or whatever. But that's the point. Is actually more largely is just a reminder, like this is what's happening, not a spell that you cast on it in order to turn it into something. But from the routine drudgery into glorifying our Father. What if routine drudgery is glorifying the Father? What if it's because it's the work, whatever work your hand finds to do it. Yeah. And we live in a cultural moment where we can be a lot more selective. We can say no to this because it's beneath us, or we can say yes to this because it meets our needs or fulfills our passions. Most Christians throughout the history of the world didn't have that. They didn't have the thing to say, well, I don't really want to do this because God made me to be a teacher. What they had to figure out how to do was to use all the gifts that God gave them in whatever the context was, even if it was a context of persecution or routine drudgery. So it has a lot more to do with how we kind of see the world and see God's sovereignty, and to see our place in it, our time and place, our situation as being a station, as the reformers would call it, which is another word for calling. Like, you've been called here. This is not an accident. Yeah, working this shift at this, minimum wage job might stink.
Yeah.
But this is what you've been called to. So now turn this into worship, or turn this into worthy worship. I'll bring in one last thing. Sorry, you remember when we talked about this last time? I got fired up. I just think this is so fun. This is such an important conversation because we have outsourced our cultural engagement to the professionals for DC and Hollywood for 3 decades now, and this is cultural engagement at its best when every Christian is caring for the world around them in this sort of framework. So I get real excited about this. But there's something that Glenn Sunshine brings up in his series that he's done for our website, Christians Who Changed the World. And we can link to that too in the show notes. But he talks about how some of the great innovations in history from entrepreneurs and business leaders, and whether you're talking about guys like Arthur Guinness or the printing press or Gutenberg or whatever, was to take the toil that was part of the curse, the frustrating part of work, the sort of work that maybe animals could do in place of humans, so humans could use higher capacities like thought and so on.
Or
and
machines.
That there's and machines, right? Yeah, to basically redeem. I don't want not the routine, but the toil part of the drudgery, the part that says, like, for example, there's been work throughout history that's just basically killed us, that's just beat us down. And to give that work to machines not only has lifted people out of poverty, raised the living standard, brought good to the world, but it also has, in a sense, turned back that part of the curse. I'm not saying human work forgives us of our sins. I'm not saying that at all. But it can help us alleviate the curse and toil. And this is a gift that Christians have thought, like, oh, I can join God's work in the world this way and bless others, give the good gifts that come from God to non-believers. So anyway, that's a lot, but you got me going. That's super exciting stuff.
It's your favorite subject, or one of them.
One of them, yeah. I got maybe 3 or 4, but that one's one of them. Yeah.
Well, this one's. I'm pretty passionate about it as well, and I won't be as long-winded as you were, John. Just for our listeners' sake. But really, this is.
Surprise.
You mentioned the Reformation, and this is one of those things that really is rooted deeply in the Reformation. I mean, people think of that, and we Protestants go, oh yeah, the doctrine of justification was recovered, and a proper place of Scripture was recovered. But another thing that was really emphasized and recovered in the Reformation was the doctrine of work, of calling, of vocation. And you see the Reformers writing about this constantly. And you see a lot of people afterwards writing about what exactly happened at the Reformation with regard to work, and why did it change our view of things, and why did it sort of remodel economies. And I wrote my capstone paper back in my undergrad days was on this at Thomas Edison. And it was on the question of Max Weber's Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. So unbelieving sociologist, real quick, he theorized that, well, Calvinists work hard because they're trying to prove their salvation, basically, because they don't know if they're predestined or not. So I re-examined that, and in light of the writings of the Reformers, said, no, actually what's going on is that the doctrine of vocation was recovered, and all work became sacred, again, or re-sacralized, if you will. And that meant that that God approved of it. It wasn't profane. Because one of the things that was the emphases lost in the medieval period was this idea that there's not a sharp, hard distinction between the sacred work that the clergy do and then the profane or common work that the people do. That was a parody of a biblical idea, which is that there are senses of worship, right? There's formal worship, which is when the sacraments are dispensed, and when we come into God's presence as His people, that type of worship is really explicitly mandated and regulated by Scripture. But there is another kind of worship, which is our common day-to-day worship as humans. The Westminster Confession says that, another Reformation document says that the chief end of man is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. And that means, John, that literally our purpose for everything we do is worship. Even salvation itself is ultimately oriented toward worshiping God. That is our chief end. And that means that work as well is part of that worship. I like to say that the Great Commission that Christ gives is in many ways a sort of servant of the creation commission, or the cultural commission, because it's the means by which we're restored to doing that constant work and worship for God in His presence, and to glorify His name, and to enjoy Him. And so as we go out and preach the gospel, we then have this big question, which the Acton Institutes for the Life of the World asked after that, which is, what are we saved for? What's the purpose after this? And the answer is, we're saved to glorify God through being human well. And that part of that is work, because work isn't a result of the fall. You've talked about this. It is toil is a result of the fall, the sort of curse on work that made it sweaty and filled with thorns and futility. That's the curse. But work itself is something we were originally commissioned to do, and which Christians are recommissioned to do in the Great Commission. There's a pun for you. So I think it comes back to getting over this idea that seems so persistent in our minds, that there are two kinds of things. There are there's the worship and sacred stuff you do either as clergy or on Sunday in church, and then there's the rest of the stuff you do, which God doesn't really care about. It's just to put food on the table and money in the bank or whatever. No, He cares deeply about it, because that's the means by which we A, serve each other, and B, worship Him by doing so, by fulfilling that original creation mandate. Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here, but it's a really incredible subject. And if you want to see the fervor with which many of these Reformation era writers talked about this, go to Martin Luther, go to Tyndale, go to Calvin, and just read the stuff they wrote about work and about there being no difference between as concerns pleasing God betwixt the washing of dishes and the preaching of the word. They were willing to say things that extreme just because they believe so deeply that everything we do can be pleasing to God. If it's within the bounds of His prescribed will, it is worship, and that's just how it. Yeah.
I'm going to get nerdy philosophical here, because what they were basing that on is a cosmology. They weren't basing it on, a random Bible verse here or there, or a particular take here or there. They were basing it on this fundamental dividing of the human experience that had been part of their culture that they thought was out of line with the creation story. The Bible does not divide the world between physical and spiritual things. The Bible divides the world between the Creator and the creation. And that's a very important thing, because if for example, atheists draw the line between the physical and the spiritual and say the physical exists, the spiritual doesn't. New Agers draw the line between the physical and spiritual and say the physical is an illusion, but the spiritual is what's really real. Christians don't divide the line between physical and spiritual. To go to the image of God question, God formed man out of the dust of the ground, physical, breathed into him the breath of life, spiritual, and man became a living soul. So the distinction in that story is not between the body and the soul. It's between the human, the creation, the image bearer, and the Creator. Now, the long-term chaos of this view is important to bring out, because some of our more liturgical or high church, deeply theological minds would say that one of the challenges of that is that. Is the banality of life, the taking of spirituality and desacramentalizing it, and would point to, for example, the example that this questioner gave, which was a great question, wasn't it? A great example, which is like, sing like you really mean it, But the idea there is that it basically put all of reality into the physical. Right, the long-term consequences. This is what Os Guinness calls the gravedigger thesis. I don't know if he came up with that or not, but he talks about that in his book, The Last Christian on Earth, which is the Reformation took everything out of the hands of the church and made it kind of temporal. And ultimately, you just had a little tiny string that kept connecting it to God, and it wasn't too long before science and technology allowed us to go bloop, and then all of reality.
This is Brad Gregory's unintended reformation, the idea that the reformers unintentionally ushered in secularism.
No, that's right, and it's a historical argument to be made. It doesn't mean that what the reformers were saying was wrong, because it wasn't. It was exactly right. It was basically what happens, and I think what happens when ideas are misguided. So this is going to be the super nerdy point. Where the reformers got it right was not because they took what was temporal and mundane and said this is just as important as the spiritual. In other words, it's not because they de-promoted.
Right.
It's not because they demoted the spiritual to the level of the temporal.
Right.
That's what ended up happening with the Enlightenment and with modernism and secularism, is that the spiritual was demoted to the temporal. What the reformers were actually trying to tell you, and they were talking to a group of people who, who had to do how did this questioner put it? Where's the phrase? The routine drudgery of milking cows and cleaning slop and all of that sort of stuff. Is the reformers were trying to say, no, that is elevated to the sacred. So they weren't demoting the sacred to the profane or to the temporal. They were taking the temporal and promoting it to the level of sacred. And if we can keep that right, there's no reason that we have to snip the God cord there. It actually then means that we're standing in God's presence all the time, and this has a lot of meaning and purpose. And like I said, jump into this conversation as this questioner. Read Dorothy Sayers on the issue of work. Read Steve Garber's book, an older one called The Visions of Vocation, and the new one called The Seamless Life. That's a great one. If you're thinking about even your own home, there's a book called Every Moment Holy, which offers prayers for what we might call the mundane and the drudgery.
I was going to recommend that one. Yeah,
That's
Douglas
a great
McKelvey even has a prayer dedicating the changing of diapers, a couple of them actually, to God for His glory. And it's beautiful. You think it's going to be funny or ridiculous.
No,
you
it's just
read that
beautiful.
prayer, it's beautiful. It'll bring tears to your eyes.
Yeah, and of course there's the actual Book of Common Prayer, which does some of that same thing. But you can also look at there's a book called Hallowed Be This House, which is a book particularly written for moms. Not exclusively, but is wrestling with the sacredness of the everyday in the home. So there's just a lot of ways to think about this. But thanks so much for that question.
Well, John, what you just said about dedicating every moment to God in prayer is precisely the point of a conversation that I had recently with Kyle Strobel on the Upstream podcast. He's just written a new book called Where Prayer Becomes Real, and the theme of that is really overcoming many of our foibles and worries and bad habits in the midst of praying to God, of coming before the throne of grace, of talking to our Father. And it was just an immensely helpful, practical, pastoral book. And the conversation that I had with Kyle, it was one of my favorites on Upstream so far, because I've been wrestling through this issue of prayer lately, and not just in how we can dedicate all of our lives to God in prayer, to prayerfully work and to pursue our vocation, but also what it means to ask God for things that we may not receive, what it means to come before Him with reverence, but also be honest with Him. And that's one of the key points of the book, is that honesty can transform your devotional life, your very soul. And that's actually the subtitle of the book. So I want to play this quick clip from my conversation with Kyle. You can find the whole thing by visiting colsoncenter.org/upstream.
It's very interesting that many of us assume prayer is a performative act. And by that I mean that what we're doing is we're performing, and we have to make sure we do the performance well. And that alone as an expectation is devastating, because the second the performance doesn't feel like it's going well, and let's be honest, like, most of us don't leave an hour of prayer feeling like, wow, I just nailed that, right? We leave an hour of prayer going, oh my goodness, what has happened? And most of it was sleep, quite honestly. Like, that was a nice nap, and then I thought about my week, and we turn inward, and we begin to kind of think that we need to kind of prod ourselves.
Well, John, we have one more question here we'd like to hit before the end of the podcast, and this is a toughie, and it comes from someone who is very much sympathetic to our points, but I think is anticipating, in many ways, going back to that first question about echo chambers, anticipating what someone outside of the quote-unquote Christian echo chamber is going to say in response to a commentary we did about adoption as a single, in response to a question we received by a woman who is who is single. She's not married, but she has a deep heart for orphans in Eastern Europe, and she wanted to adopt. So we answered that question both on this podcast and in a Breakpoint commentary. This person asks in response to that. Last week, you had a question from a single woman asking about adoption. She was concerned that kids need a mom and a dad. You encouraged her to adopt, given her mindset. However, I could make the same argument you did for her with same-sex couples. It seems like you left the door open for that. I recognize being a single woman is not a sin, and being a same-sex couple is. Is that the answer you'd give?
Yes.
If the woman... Okay.
Yes, that's the answer. You can read the second part of the question because
the second part of the
it gets
question,
more
yeah,
interesting. But yeah, that is a simple and definitive difference between the two. But go ahead.
This person continues. If the woman who wrote you, instead of being single, said she was a Christian with a woman spouse, and she understood that Christian children need a mother and a father, but she has a strong desire to be a mother, and she and her partner have a wonderful, loving relationship, and is it really better for a child to be in a home or a foster care system instead of being in a loving home with this woman and her female spouse? Thanks again. I'm grateful for all y'all do. Excellent work. So we got that little sweetener at the end there.
Yeah. After throwing that question.
All right. So how about it, John?
Well, that second point is a great one. Let me just be clear too what the question was. The question wasn't, from this single woman, am I okay? And then are same-sex couples okay to make the same decision? She was asking about her own situation, and her own situation has no moral issues whatsoever. There's nothing in her story, as we knew it, unless there's something we don't know, in which she shows any confusion whatsoever about the reality of male and female as part of the created order, how that actually plays into both marriage and parenting, and then eventually into society.
She even goes out of her way to acknowledge it and then analyze her own motives on that basis.
Right. So we didn't justify her decision, or we didn't agree with her decision, or I didn't, based on the fact that she wanted them. We actually made that distinction between her desire and her situation. In this other case, so in other words, there wasn't any sort of equivocation between the two situations. She was specifically asking about her own, given her own motivations and what she understood needed to be the case. Now, look, legally, that's a different point, whether we should make something illegal or how do we actually take something that now is legal and backpedal it, which is a very difficult thing to do in the case of, so-called LGBTQ rights in these areas and so on.
The question we're really asking is what is best for the child? What are the rights of the child call for, and how do we fulfill that person's needs?
Let me say this: there's for this single woman to say, "I know a father would be absent," is very different than a same-sex couple saying, "This other woman can play the role of a father,"
right?
Or this other man can play the role of a mother. Or that somehow, by adding us two men together, we'll end up with an equivalent of what a mother and a father can bring. They can't. It's not a moral position. It's not having to do with having good intentions or bad intentions. It actually isn't the case. This was something that Maria Baer brought up when we had a conversation about Bethany Christian Services. That Bethany Christian Services now, in an attempt to help children, has actually said, in a sense, that to help a child here is something that overcomes the potential wrong things they will learn about male, female, in the future. So Bethany Services has, in a sense, become a teacher that now aligns with the new sexual orthodoxy, saying it's no big deal. And the fact of the matter is, as far as I can see, both theologically, sociologically, anthropologically, and biblically, to equivocate those two is a big deal. So we're talking about an apple and oranges situation. Now, to this questioner's point, look, you say, for example, that marriage is inherently connected to procreation, and then you hear, well, what about people who are past the age of procreation, and if they can get married, therefore two men and two women can get married, because we're talking about infertility is infertility. Infertility is not infertility, right? A functioning system that no longer functions is not the same, or a system that's intended to function a particular way but doesn't, is not the same as a completely different system or a completely different set of functions. And we're talking about apples and oranges, and we can draw that line. Now, that doesn't mean that legally this argument as compelling because there's a whole lot of other forces at work. But if this woman had, in fact, come to us, and if we get another question in the coming weeks in which a woman says, look, I realize that children need a mother and a father. I'm in a loving, committed, monogamous relationship, with someone of the same sex, and we want to help a child, then my answer will be different.
Yeah, I think that's right, John. You center it on not just the fact that sin is is the basis of the relationship, but based on the fact that a lie is enshrined at the center of the relationship. That a child is being taught something about male and female. There's a denial of the necessity for both sexes to be involved there. So instead of a mother who's helping to make the best of a situation that a child is in by bringing that child into what she understands as a less than ideal environment, we have an environment that is it literally orbits around a denial of that need for both sexes. And so there's a teaching function, there's an endorsing function going on here. It's much more than just the sort of on the ground facts of where a child sleeps, who feeds the child, that sort of thing. And when I think about it, I guess I would counter with a question like this. If someone came to me and sort of aggressively asked this, was like, "Well, what about same-sex couples? You just said that a single mother should be able to adopt," and I'd bring it back to this idea of creating brokenness versus healing existing brokenness. I think you're creating new brokenness by bringing a child into a same-sex home that fundamentally denies the necessity of a father. I mean, Katie Faust talks about this, where when you're the child of a same-sex couple, you enter this really, really delicate dance because on the one hand, you've got a desperate wound in your life. You've been denied a father or a mother, depending on the situation, and yet you're not allowed to express that, at least not openly, because that is perceived as an attack on your loving parents. So they look at that and say, well, weren't we enough? No, you weren't enough. But being brought into an environment where a single mother has adopted you, who is openly acknowledging your need for a father as well, and then seeking to remedy that brokenness through bringing you into a larger community where there are positive male figures, where there are sort of spiritual fathers in a way that can speak into your life. That's a totally different situation, and I think that we're warranted in distinguishing sharply between the two on that basis.
Yeah.
Well, we mentioned Katie Faust just now in her book, Them Before Us, and you guys actually did a webinar recently with her talking through some of the major points of the book here. And this is our premium for this month at the Colson Center. So you give a donation of any amount this month in March, and we'll give you a copy of Katie Faust's book. You can find that at breakpoint.org/March 2021. And I want you to listen to a short snippet from that webinar because Katie's resource is just fantastic, and she's an excellent advocate for the cause of children.
We just give you about 30 stories of kids who were raised by same-sex couples who talk about their desperate, almost obsessive longing for the missing maternal or paternal love that they were made for. Chapter 7, we talk about sperm and egg donation and the deep, very distinct struggles that these kids experience. Feelings of commodification, like I am uncomfortable. It feels like I was bought and sold because I was literally chosen out of a catalog. The reality that they suffer from the genealogical bewilderment of wondering, why do I look this way? Where did I get these features? Fantasizing about their missing parent, even if they were created through sperm donation, but raised by a loving father. A lot of times these kids fall asleep at night fantasizing about that missing biological connection. Who is my mother? Does she know that I exist? Will I ever find her? Have I already walked past her on the street and not even known about it? I mean, these are really common questions that kids ask.
Well, folks, I want to thank you so much for listening to the Breakpoint podcast today. We'll be back next week answering more of your worldview questions. If you want to ask a question, you can drop us a message on social media or email us. The address is askthecolsoncenter@colsoncenter.org, and we'd love to engage with it here on the program. For John Stone Street and the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris. We'll see you next time.